Well, good afternoon, students. This is Mr. Giordano. This is another installment of Flip Lesson brought to you again by me, your teacher, AP Economics. What we're going to do today is actually take a little bit of what we learned recently in class and on the videos to talk about how we can take this information and apply it to some of the information from AP macro exams. We're actually going to take a look at the AP macroeconomics exam from 2010, number one free response question. And I'm going to try to break it apart. If you take a look, it's actually number one is the long free response question on this, and if we want to take what we know so far about the aggregate supply and aggregate demand models, we are only going to be able to do number one, part A, part B, part C. Part D and part E are things that we haven't really even talked about up to this point, but we will be learning about that very shortly, maybe even in the next video that goes along with this assignment. So let's take a look at this AP question. Number one, we start off and says, assume that the United States economy is currently in long-run equilibrium. So if we're in long-run equilibrium, that means that we're going to have to be looking at a long-run aggregate supply curve, and how this all works out on the graphs that we've been looking at with long-run aggregate supply and short-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, etc. So let's take a look at this, see if we can play around with it. Letter A says draw a correctly labeled graph of aggregate demand and aggregate supply and show each of the following. Number one, the long-run aggregate supply curve, so that's something that we have to have. Number two, the current equilibrium output and price levels, labeled as YE and PLE respectively. So let's take a look at that first. Let's tackle this part and graph it out. So let's see what it looks like. All right. So they're asking us to do something that we should be very accustomed to this point. We're gonna draw ourselves a graph. And one of the things that I highly recommend to students is that they, again, get very comfortable with how to graph out aggregate supply and demand in a macroeconomy. We make sure that we always label our axes. This is the price level axis, and this axis is real GDP, measured in real GDP, as we talked about in class. Remember, C plus G plus I plus NX. And then we're going to need to draw our supply and demand curves. Now, the one thing that they asked us already to do on this particular question is to show the long-run aggregate supply curve, but they also told us to correctly label everything and show this in what they're considering long-run equilibrium. Well, how do we do that? Let's do it now. So we have our axes labeled. I like to use a kind of hodgepodge of the different models that we learned about. Remember, we were talking about the Keynesian model. We were also talking about the two Keynesian models and also the new classical model. So what I like to do is just kind of give you a little bit of everything mixed into one. Let's take a look at this. How do we label this thing? Well, remember, we need to figure out what this looks like in long-run equilibrium. That's where our economy is. Remember, if we're at long-run equilibrium, that means that our aggregate demand curve must be intersecting with the long-run aggregate supply curve. Well, remember, the long-run aggregate supply curve is actually only this portion of the aggregate supply curve that we see here on this Keynesian model. So we can label this long-run aggregate supply, but remember, we also are going to need to show the entire long-run aggregate supply, and I'm going to do this with a dotted line to represent the rest of the long-run aggregate supply curve at that point. Remember, in this case, that we also have to show long-run equilibrium. So we are at a point in the economy where we have reached the maximization of our economy. We have used all resources to their most efficient use. So we are actually beyond the Keynesian range of the long-run aggregate supply curve. We are also beyond the intermediate range of the long-run aggregate supply curve. And we've moved, remember that PPF and that PPC, that we've gotten to the point where we've maximized things. So in this case, we're actually going to be able to show our aggregate demand curve at that point. So let's label everything like we are supposed to do. Here's our aggregate demand curve. This is our long-run aggregate supply curve. Again, the intermediate range and the Keynesian range on the long-run aggregate supply. But we can also take this a step further again and show our short-run aggregate supply curve. So let's show our short-run aggregate supply curve here. Remember, it's this portion, the short-run aggregate supply curve. I'm just going to do it with a dotted line and label it short-run aggregate supply. So now we have something that looks pretty cool. If we were to graph this out on in a classical method, or the new classical method, it would basically look like this and this, aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, with long-run aggregate supply at the intersection point. And we wouldn't have this Keynesian part of the short-run aggregate supply curve. So it looks very similar. Again, if you graph it properly and you label everything properly and you show everything in the way you're supposed to show it, whichever model that you choose to use is probably going to be fine for you on the AP exam. Actually, the answer to this question on the AP macro exam in this year showed the usage of the new classical model. But this would be just as appropriate. So what's long-run equilibrium? Well, remember we have to put YF. We are at full employment. We've maximized all of our resources in our economy. What else was it asking us to do? Let's take a look back at it. Long-run aggregate supply curve. Did we do that? Let's take a look. Yes, we did. We have our long-run aggregate supply curve. Perfectly inelastic here. Let's take a look back again. What the current equilibrium output and price levels are, YE, PLE. Well, we did YF. So let's follow the directions because we don't want to lose points for mislabeling anything. Let's label that YE. And where's the price level? Well, remember, the price level is going to be where the short-run aggregate supply curve and aggregate demand curve intersect on the long-run aggregate supply curve at equilibrium. So in order to do that, all we have to do is just show our price level right here at the intersection of these two and label it as it asks us to do as PLE. All right, from what I'm looking at, it seems to be that we've appropriately graphed out everything that we need to know and labeled it for A. We should get all the points for that. We have our long-run aggregate supply curve. We have the current equilibrium output price and price levels. We have everything labeled accurately. So let's take this a step further, right? And we're going to move on because this is what they're going to do to you. They're going to give you that example. They're going to ask you to graph it out. You're going to have to be asked to know that part, and then they're going to start making changes and adjustments to the economy. So let's look what they're doing in letter B.